We've got the former Prime Minister of Australia, founding member of the G20, Kevin Rudd. Mr. Prime Minister, very good to have you.
Good to be with you.
You've been to these shindigs and all. Does anything get done?
Yeah, not all G20 meetings, but some of them have been quite decisive, particularly the one that we held at the height of the global financial crisis, which was fundamental to preventing that recession as it was unfolding from becoming a full-blown recession.
2009.
2009 March in London. I remember it clearly as if it was yesterday. But they've been up and down since then. Some have been more substantive than others. Of course, the focus in Buenos Aires will be less on the collective G20 agenda, which represents 75% of global trade and 80% of the global economy across those 20 countries. There'll be more focus on the bilat between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, and can we avert a further expansion, escalation of the trade war into a more general economic war.
What do you think on that front?
Well, I don't know the mind of the president on this. He's a hard guy to pick. And I think President Trump would probably be pleased if someone like me, as a commentator, would say he's a hard guy to pick. I was recently in Beijing talking to our Chinese friends. They find him a hard guy to pick as well. So that's obviously part of his negotiating strategy. The Chinese are also aware of the fact that you have different views in the White House. You have people like Secretary Mnuchin from the Treasury,
right,
who probably would have preferred to have a deal yesterday to calm markets. Then you've got the chap you've just been talking about, Peter.
Yeah, what did you make of that? Now, I thought he had entered the witness protection program because no one's seen or heard from him, and then he reappears and gets this prominent seat at a table with Xi Jinping and Donald Trump.
Well, as you know, Mr. Navarro gave this quite remarkable speech in Washington recently, attacking billionaire advisors to the president, suggesting that those billionaire advisors were urging the president to go soft on China. So I think that may have landed him in the doghouse for a bit. I don't know.
But maybe he reflects the president's gut.
Well, I think you've got this range of views within the White House. It's plain as day, not just to those of us who follow the entrails of this here in the United States, but to our Chinese friends as well, that there is a group which not only wants a hard outcome if one can be delivered in relation to China, but there is a group who would prefer no outcome. That is a long-term protracted decoupling of the American and Chinese economies as part of an unfolding neo-containment policy against China. So which way President Trump finally jumps on this is an unknown. My instinct, for what it's worth, and it's just an instinct, because I don't know the president personally, is he'll be looking very much at American markets. You've seen a whole bunch of stock market volatility here in the United States. He's looking at a re-elect in 2020. He would like not to have a expanding trade war become the trigger into a conclusion of the current business and economic cycle, let alone triggering a wider recession.
Something, even if it's cosmetic, is started at this.
Well, I think two specific things could happen. One, if they can reach an agreement in Buenos Aires on, let's call it, the scope of the reduction in the bilateral trade deficit, say to a scale of about 100 billion, and then secondly, a series of fundamental tariff changes which bring Chinese tariffs closer to American levels, that may be sufficient to cause the United States to defer the current scheduled increase in American tariffs on Chinese imports.
But it would be based on a promise that the Chinese, at least in the past, have not been very good at keeping.
No, on those two questions...
Well, these would be new areas.
That they would be, as it were, pretty easily measurable as to whether you were doing them or not. But that would be the precondition for, I think, the president deferring the implementation of the next two rounds of tariff increases against all $500 billion worth of Chinese exports.
Well, do you think that's what his strategy was when he just out of the blue, unbeknownst to his advisors, said, you know, there's going to be a tariff on electronic items made in China coming to the United States? Everyone was shocked at that, but he could just shelve that and said that one's off.
Well, what he could do is say, hey, President Xi's arrived in town. He's got a better deal than his officials have been talking to my officials about for the last 3 weeks. The Chinese currently have on the table a 142-point document. I haven't seen it, but knowing the President of the United States, he probably won't be all that interested in a 142-point document. He'll be looking at the big headline and whether, in fact, President Xi's willing to radically decrease tariff protection against the full range of Chinese imports from the United States. And then what you could do is perhaps organise a subsequent working level summit, say March plus, to deal with the other remaining structural questions in the US-China economic relationship, which is about a new regime for intellectual property protection and an enforceable mechanism to prevent the forced transfer of technology. And finally, state subsidy. I think this is a really hard one, state subsidy for China's current high technology drive.
Interesting. They are interesting events, though. Great to cover. A lot of dinners, apparently. Prime Minister, thank you very, very much. Kevin Rudd, just back from China. We'll be following that very closely.